All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So this is another webinar that's a part of our Be Well Talk series. And so for today's talk, we're very pleased to be able to offer this webinar in partnership with Pancreatic Cancer Canada. And so just to make sure you are in the right place, this webinar today is on managing the impact of pancreatic cancer on families. All right, I will pass it over to Beth for our speaker introduction.
Hi, everyone. Unfortunately, we did just lose our speaker for a second. Sarah is joining us, but she's having some technical difficulties, so she's just logging in and logging out. So I'll talk about her behind her back while she logs back in. My name is Beth Ruby. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at Pancreatic Cancer Canada, and I too want to thank you all for joining us today. I first met Sarah and her brother David over a year ago. David was in the end stages of pancreatic cancer, and he was determined to leave a legacy by sharing his story with us. Since he passed, Sarah has beautifully and respectfully honored David's legacy by working with pancreatic cancer to raise awareness in the hope that fewer families experience this devastating disease. As you can see on the slide, Sarah is a trauma-informed trainer, a practitioner, an artist, an activist, an educator, and a children's grief specialist who combines her lived experience of losing her brother with her professional experience as a grief specialist to help families navigate the complex emotional and mental challenges of grief and dying. We're incredibly grateful to Sarah for sharing her time and her expertise in today's session. And once again, I just want to thank everybody for joining us. I see that Sarah is logged back in, but I don't think her camera's on yet. So hopefully we can get her and then I can hand the mic over to her.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Illiatovitch-Goldman, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you today. I am here because I am supposed to be an expert on the impact of cancer on families, specifically children, and specifically pancreatic cancer. It is Pancreatic Cancer Awareness Month, after all. And all of that really means that I'm here today because I'm supposed to be an expert on grief and death. Because as many of us, too many of us know, pancreatic cancer diagnosis more often than not amounts to a death sentence. I find it somewhere between ironic and hilarious that death and grief are my area of expertise, because I'm someone who really hates death. And I want to be crystal clear about this. I am not someone who is kumbaya about this subject or death. I've been afraid of death for myself and my loved ones for as long as I understood the concept. And yet, both personally and professionally, death now occupies a good amount of my time and knowledge. So a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Toronto and trained as a theater artist. I went to a performing arts high school and a theater conservatory for acting, and all I wanted to do was create and act and tell stories. That was my goal. After I graduated, I was lucky that I got to do exactly what I wanted to do. I got to work in those fields, but as many of us know, being an independent artist is not a huge moneymaker, and my landlord didn't care if what I was doing was technically worthwhile if I couldn't pay my rent. So I started looking for other ways to supplement my income, using my art, including things like running workshops in schools, teaching in summer camps and day camps, and most impactfully for me, teaching theater in homeless youth shelters. And that's really when I started thinking about where community and the arts intersect. In 2012, I moved to Chicago to further pursue my career in theater, and I continued doing a lot of teaching and community work. Issues in Chicago, rather, are a lot more blatant than they are in Toronto, and so systems of inequity, particularly involving class and race, are very much in your face. Seeing this alongside events of the world made me feel more and more like I needed to do something and make sure I was making a positive impact in my community. And this led me to two things that shaped my life and are why I'm here today. One, after seeing the inequities in the school system in Chicago, particularly in Black and brown neighborhoods, and being devastated by what I saw, I was encouraged to sign up for a trauma-informed workshop specifically for teaching artists. In it, I learned about what trauma really is and isn't, and the deep impact that trauma has on our brains, bodies, human interactions, and development. I studied and became a certified trauma and resilience practitioner, an instructor. And if you've ever talked to me for more than 5 minutes, you know that this work is my absolute passion in life. Number two, I decided to switch my career from using art as a performance and artistic methodology for myself and use it as far as impact and activism. And I was lucky enough to become the director of a program called Hearts to Art, an artistic summer camp in Chicago for young people ages 7 to 14 who've experienced the death of a parent or primary caregiver. Run by the Auditorium Theater, this incredible program was founded by the Auditorium's former CEO, Brett Batterson, whose dad had died suddenly when he was quite young. Brett found that the arts became his salvation in his grief, and that what he got from this community helped him to survive in the wake of his father's death. So when he came into a position of prominence and power at the Auditorium, he decided to create this program where young people who had experienced a loss similar to his got to go to summer camp and engage with the arts and heal. So all of a sudden, I myself, a person who hates death, is terrified of death, locked myself in my house after the Pulse night shooting occurred, am navigating the death and grief of 50+ families a year, and am somehow responsible for their care and healing. It may seem strange that this is what I decided the job was for me, but in the process of applying, I got to meet some of the families that the camp served, and I immediately knew that this opportunity was incredibly special. What I learned from that job has made me a better person in every capacity, and I truly credit it with saving my life. Because in 2021, my big brother David was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He died 1 year and 6 days ago, and I thank every single thing out there every day that I had enough of a background in this community and this work to survive this experience. So now that you know some of my background and why I'm here, I want to share some of what I've learned with you. I want to start with the difference between grief and trauma, because these are two things that often get confused, and it's incredibly important both for yourself and especially dealing with kids and families to understand that they are not the same thing. So the definition of trauma is any experience that leaves you feeling helpless, hopeless, or fearing for your life. Trauma can be real or perceived. I'm going to say that again in case there was an internet issue or you didn't get it the first time. Trauma is any experience that leaves you feeling helpless, hopeless, or fearing for your life. Trauma can be real or perceived. The big thing I want you to take away from this, especially as far as navigating death, is that there is no threshold to what creates trauma. Trauma is a response that happens in our bodies when our bodies perceive that they are in a helpless, hopeless, or dangerous situation. There is no such thing as a traumatic event. There are many events that often cause trauma or carry the air marks of trauma, but because trauma is entirely connected to an individual's perception and experience, there is no objective way of knowing if something was traumatic or how that trauma has impacted that person individually. Let me give you a couple of examples of how this can play out. So my trauma-informed mentor told a story in his training about 2 family members of his who got robbed in Chicago when they were kids. They bought a bunch of candy and some teens came up and robbed them. The first kid saw that one of the muggers had a gun on them. The other one didn't. For the person who saw the gun, that event became a traumatic experience because they felt like their life was in danger. For the other person, they thought that, kids took their candy and they brushed it off. Not an awesome day, but not a big deal. So right there, you have 2 people who've experienced the same event at the same time, but had 2 different perceptions of what was happening. For one person, it was a life-threatening moment. For the other, it wasn't. Now, on the flip side, if neither of them had seen a gun, but if one of them had thought they'd seen a gun, seen something in a pocket like a finger or something that they perceived was a gun, the event could have been equally as traumatic because your body responds to what it believes is happening. It goes into flight or fight or freeze based on what it thinks is happening. What is objectively true or not is entirely inconsequential. So that's one example of how trauma and perception work. Another example is from a young girl who worked with a clinician that I trained under, and her father was sent to jail. When the clinician asked the girl how she felt about her father being incarcerated, she said she felt really good about it because she knew that the bad guys who were after him couldn't get him in jail. What she was talking about was the fact that she knew her father was involved in gang activity, and her belief was that her dad couldn't be reached by these gang members when he was in jail. Again, that's not necessarily objectively true, but it meant for this girl, her dad being in jail was not a traumatic experience, because for her, when he wasn't incarcerated is when she felt helpless and hopeless about his safety. Now, for another kid, their dad being sent to jail would have been a very traumatic experience. So all of this is to say is that trauma is not something we should ever assume that a child is experiencing. Death of someone very close to you, or your person, as I like to say, certainly has a lot of elements that can leave you feeling helpless, hopeless, or fearing for your life. But that's not necessarily the case. So we should never, ever assume that someone around us, including children in our care, are experiencing trauma just because they've experienced a particular life event. Now let's switch from trauma into grief. So to start off with, grief is a positive thing to experience. Grief is entirely natural, and honestly, a lot of the time, it's not something that you need to worry about or attempt to fix. It can require support in all kinds of ways. It can be slow, certainly brutally painful, deeply uncomfortable, but it's not something to be afraid of. The number one word we associate with trauma is terror. The number one word we associate with grief is sadness. Living in a state of terror is bad for your body. It changes your body's reactions to things around you. Living in a state of sadness doesn't feel particularly good, but it doesn't hurt you. And to be clear, depression is not grief. Depression is hopelessness to get out of your sadness. Helplessness and hopelessness are connected to trauma. If someone you love is not there anymore, feeling sadness, no matter your age, no matter how it comes out, is a 100% healthy thing. In fact, not feeling sadness is the thing that you would need to worry about. Now, sadness, like trauma, does not look one particular way. Grief does not mean crying or screaming or shutting down. There is no specific way that it should look, and it's a highly individualized experience like anything else. But it is actually something that's important to experience when you have had a loss. So here are some of the key differences between grief and trauma. As I said, grief is sadness. Trauma is terror. Pain and grief is related to loss. Trauma, pain is related to powerlessness and fear. Grief is something we know. We understand grief and we understand why we grieve. Trauma is largely unknown. First of all, the study of trauma scientifically is relatively new. And second, because trauma has no threshold, it can be incredibly difficult to identify. In fact, you often identify someone's trauma reaction before you identify if they've had a trauma itself. Grief does not disfigure your identity, and trauma does. This last one is the biggest and truly the most important thing to understand and to watch for, especially when dealing with loss. If you hear someone in your life after a loss say something like, "He died because of me," or "I should have been able to keep her alive," or anything like that, that's a potential indicator of trauma. Anything where the reaction to the loss is absorbed as a characteristic of your identity is a trauma indicator, potentially. Whereas anything related to sadness or longing to be close to someone is an indicator of grief. Even sometimes you'll hear kids say after their person dies that they want to die too, to be close to them, which is a very scary thing to hear, but that's more of an indicator of grief than trauma. This is the biggest thing that I want you to take away as far as these differences. That trauma disfigures how you see yourself in the world, and that's the real danger of it. Trauma can actually rewire your neural pathways in your brain and do things that stall your ability to move forward in your life. Whereas grief is something that lives with you, alongside you. It's painful, but it's painful because what you've gone through is painful. We used to think that, something sad would happen and you would grieve, and then over time, grief would get smaller and smaller until it was nearly gone, right? Pulled out on special occasions like your person's birthday or the anniversary of their death. Anyone who's experienced grief knows that that is not how it works. It doesn't go away on a timeline. It pops up when it's unpredicted. It's certainly not something that you can count on disappearing. Grief changes. It surprises you. It can be violent pain or a dull pain, but it can be a pretty constant companion. The way people are now starting to talk about grief, the way that I personally talk about grief, is that your grief actually stays the same size and you grow around it. you start to expand. And I think that this is a beautiful image, the concept of you growing around your grief. And I don't mean that in a way of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or it's all part of a greater plan. I mean that anyone who's experienced deep grief knows that it does push you. It expands your boundaries. It expands who you are. It expands what you think you're capable of. It's not good or bad. It just is. So your grief stays the same size, but slowly you're able to do more, balance more, bring more back into your life alongside your grief. Grief, however, can become trauma. So how does this happen? Well, when we try to shut down our grief, it can become something else. This is how depression and trauma come out of a grieving situation. This is how we end up with helplessness and hopelessness when we are grieving, by trying to put rules on our grief, by trying to push past it or stop it. And this is especially possible when we are an adult who is grieving, dealing with a child who is grieving. Society has told us that we're not supposed to talk about death. Society has told us that kids shouldn't learn about death. As a result, we don't normalize death. But guess what? The two things that happen to every person on this earth is that we're born and we're going to die. And yet these two topics have become tabooed and shamed out of polite society or conversation, especially with little kids. And this is the fastest way towards turning your kids' grief into trauma. And I'm not saying that to be scary or cruel. And please know that it's okay if it's something you're not comfortable with. There are lots of tools and supports to help you. But I do want to be serious and a little urgent about this matter. Because again, this has been my line of work. And there is a world of difference between a kid who showed up in my program comfortable with death and what happened to their person, and one who didn't. Again, trauma is any experience that leaves you feeling helpless, hopeless, or fearing for your life. When we don't discuss death with our kids, we let their imaginations soar about what has happened and what could happen. And we let their imaginations soar alone in isolation. We teach our kids what is okay to talk about and not okay to talk about by how we model our behavior for them. So if they never hear us talking about death, never initiating conversations about death, if they hear us talk in whispered tones or shut things down when they enter the room, if we answer their questions vaguely or say they aren't old enough or change subjects as fast as we possibly can, we are teaching them that it's not okay for them to talk to the people who they've been told to trust most about this incredibly important topic. And so what do? They start making up narratives and piecing together what they know and filling in what they don't. And this is dangerous. This is where helplessness and hopelessness thrives. Much like studies show us that kids who don't receive sex ed are at higher risk of STIs and unwanted pregnancies, kids who don't learn about death are at a higher risk of being negatively impacted by the impacts of death. At Hearts to Art, we would have kids all the time who would come to the program who didn't know the cause of their parents' death. We would even have kids come to the program who didn't know it was a program for death. A lot of grief programs actually won't allow kids to attend if they don't know the details of the death. They will work with caregivers and make sure that the child knows the facts of their parents' death, because it's so key, so medically key, that a kid understands what has happened. Hearts to Art didn't do that because we were what was referred to as a brief therapeutic intervention. And so it wasn't clinically responsible to throw a grenade into a family structure that we weren't going to be around to pick the pieces up of. But we would do an intense intake with caregivers and always encourage families to share the reasons of death if they didn't know, and offer resources to help them. It is impossible to heal from a wound if you've been told your wound is invisible. How can you sit with your grief and grow around your grief if you don't know actually what's happened? One year we had a kid at camp whose parents died, I believe, of an overdose. And this child was quite young when this happened. And so the family didn't share the details of the death to shield the child. The result, however, was what the child did know was that their dad had died the night they ate tacos. Therefore, in her mind, tacos killed her dad. By the time she came to camp, she was terrified, almost phobic, of tacos and any spicy condiments. She felt helpless and hopeless and was fearing for her own life, because without an adult helping her put the pieces together appropriately, she put them together herself. And this is what she came up with. Now, cancer doesn't carry the same taboos as overdose or suicide, and so it's rare for a child not to know the cause of death at all. But it's not rare for a child not to be involved in or know the severity of a person's illness, and that's equally as problematic. So what do we do about this? How do we talk to kids about death? How do we make it okay that death has taken up residence in our homes? In order to do this, I think we have to be honest about something, and this really, to me, is the crux of the issue. I think adults don't talk to kids about death because we can't handle it. There is nothing worse in the whole world than causing pain for your kid. And so we want to shield our children out of love for what they go through. But actually, I think we want to shield ourselves from having these conversations. Because here's the thing, a kid, especially a young kid who doesn't really understand death, isn't afraid of it, isn't that affected by it. Their fear, their sadness is entirely linked to how we bring it into their lives. Our larger, more complex feelings about the situation, especially if we're talking about it because it's something we're dealing with ourselves in the moment, are the feelings that are messy. So we try to shield ourselves from having these conversations because we understand the weight of them and we don't want to put that on our children. I get that. I have 3 kids. But impact is greater than intention, and not talking to your kids is not doing them any favors. Unfortunately, doing what's best for your kid, not what makes your kid happiest, is the job of parenting. When my brother was sick, I had to talk to my then 3-year-old about the fact that her uncle was dying. I had to explain what death was, and I had to explain that as a result of her uncle dying, her mom was going to be sad a lot of the time, and that life was going to look different, and that she was probably going to be exposed to some things that, quite frankly, weren't awesome. So step 1, if you have a kid, I would say 3, 4, older, and you don't have imminent death in your family, talk to them about death now. Explain it before it's on your doorstep, because when it is, you are already dysregulated from your own experience and you are dealing with grief, and that makes it so much harder to present it in a way that doesn't scare your child. So talk about death. Read books about it. The Invisible String is an excellent book. The 10th Good Thing About Barney is an excellent book. When Someone Dies is an excellent book. There are so many picture books out there now to help parents talk to kids about death. Answer their questions as honestly as you can. As far as heaven or the afterlife, my feeling is if religion is actively a part of your family in a day-to-day, moment-to-moment practice, then it should be part of how you have this discussion. However, if your family is not actively practicing a religion, or if you are using the concept of heaven in a way to avoid questions or create comfort for them or for you, I would encourage you to find another way in. Once the conversation is started with them, see how they react. Ask them to talk to you about their questions. Let it be a part of your life. My daughter started building it into games. Shortly after she first talked, I noticed a lot of her stuffies were getting sick and often dying. I said to her one day, "Hey, I just want to be clear that just because someone's sick doesn't mean they're going to die." She looked at me with a puzzled look and said, "Yeah, Mom, I know. It's just a game." And games are a great way for kids to process death and feelings. If you see them playing it out, don't shut it down. Play with them. Learn how they are thinking about these things. Ask questions and try to follow their logic instead of imposing your own. In a way, when it came to talking to my daughter about death, I was lucky. The same week we found out that my brother's cancer was terminal, we found out that my parents' cat, Pickles, was very sick and needed to be put down. My daughter was really close with this cat, and so we got a little practice round right in the moment where I really needed it. Now, I recommended those books to you a moment before, and I stand by them, but for me, there are a few things more useful as far as initiating, honest conversation with kids than Mr. Rogers. As Mr. Rogers said, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be manageable. In his episode, When Pets Die, he does an exceptional job of looking at pets honestly, including reading a book he wrote by the same name. In it, he is clear that there are parts of dying we don't understand and parts we do. He says, "One thing we know about dying is that it isn't like going to sleep. When something alive goes to sleep, it can wake up again. When a pet dies, it isn't alive anymore, and so it can't wake up again." This is how we need to talk to kids about death. Terms like went to sleep or lost are not helpful because they're not true. As a caretaker I worked with once said, "I didn't lose my husband, he died. If I lost him, I'd just go and find him." These comforting euphemisms are not comforting to children. They create terror. If you think the possibility of going to sleep means you will never wake up, That creates terror, and terror is what we want to avoid. So my daughter and I watched Mr. Rogers together, and it opened up the dialogue that let me then transition at a later time into the news that we found out Uncle Dave is going to die. When bringing death into your family and into dialogue with your kids, you want to be as calm as you possibly can, while still letting it be okay to show whatever emotions may be brought on. You want to normalize that it's okay to have feelings, that it's okay to cry, that you can still be there for them and be sad. That is a powerful lesson to offer, that being sad does not mean you stop being their parent. However, if your emotions start getting the better of you, if you worry you're going to start hyperventilating or becoming so overwhelmed that you can't communicate, then this is where you may need some help in talking to your kids. The reason for this is not that those are bad reactions, but they may be scary. And if your kid worries about you or worries that talking about this will make you scary or get out of control, it may shut them down from talking to you or asking you questions. Kids want to protect their parents as much as parents want to protect their kids. When I talked to my daughter about my brother, my husband was with me. At camp, when people would share their experiences, someone, usually me, would be on standby to do what we would call a tap-in. This meant that if someone was talking and they would get overwhelmed and start getting too emotional to communicate, I would tap in and explain what was happening. I'd ask the kids, do you have any questions about what they've already said? Or did you ever have a time where your feelings got so big that you couldn't talk? Essentially, buying time for the person to keep going. As scary as it is to see someone lose control, it's also empowering to see someone regain control. Seeing that feelings come and go is a powerful experience. So if you feel too overwhelmed to have the conversations with your kids, I'd urge you to still be present for the conversation or to follow up immediately after. Let them know that it's okay. The key, again, is to normalize these feelings and death as a part of life. So we don't want to run from it. We want it to move through us, and we want to show that to our children. This moves into the next phase, which is what happens after the conversation if you're dealing with grief and illness is getting worse and worse. If you and your family are comfortable sitting in grief and having these hard conversations at first, then the hard work is done and the groundwork is laid. As I watched my brother get sicker and sicker, I had every range of emotion, often right in front of my child. But I could say to her, hey, I'm having a lot of big feelings about Uncle Dave right now. Can you give me a minute? Or, I'm sorry, I was crying so much earlier. I needed to sit with all of my feelings. But I'm in a better place now, so let's keep going. Do you have any feelings about what you want to share? Do you have any questions about what happened? The language will be slightly different depending on the age of the child, but the concept is the same. The more that you can model that all forms of feelings are okay and not something to be afraid of or avoided, the more tools and strength you give your child for how they can deal with this and process death. Kids deal with death in a very, very different way than adults. In fact, often in a healthier way. They want to talk about it and then they want to drop it. They'll say something strikingly poignant and then they'll go back to playing or ask what's for dinner. This can be hard for us as grown-ups to hold. We are the ones figuring out how to have these conversations, how to show up, and then they run off and have all the fun and we're left holding all the feelings. So part of the work is finding your own safe spaces separate from your kids and family, be it with friends, other people in your family not affected, on your own, or professionals, where you can release all that you are holding and get some support for yourself. My daughter created the concept of a dying day for my brother and would often ask me, is today Uncle Dave's dying day? She'd say it so casually and it would always throw me off guard. So I'd take a minute, take a breath, and then answer her as calmly as possible so that she didn't feel like she was doing anything wrong by asking. Then I would go find a pillow, put my face into it, and scream. As hard as these moments were, it was also beautiful to see her owning and putting together all of these pieces in a way that made her feel safe. Because if someone has a dying day, then there's some control over what happens. There's less opportunity for fear and less opportunity for trauma. So by her wanting to assign a specific date, it de-escalated for her this overwhelming concept of death. My daughter at 4 years old watched her uncle die. She sat next to him with the whole family as he slowly slipped away from us in his own living room. She drew him pictures. She held his hand. She read him books. She was a part of the process. I'm incredibly proud of her, but I'm also incredibly proud of all of us in our family for listening to her boundaries and not shielding her from what was going on. There were certainly times during her illness where he scared her. A new apparatus would show up. There were weird sounds. He started looking worse and worse. We never forced her to hug him if she didn't want to. We never forced her to spend extra time with him, to talk to him, to do anything that was more for us or him than for her. We just normalized that we were going to be around Uncle Dave, and that Uncle Dave was sick and dying, and that we'd try to answer any questions she had, and that we'd listen to any feelings or thoughts she wanted to share. And in that, she learned that mom and dad have big feelings too, and that we love him a lot, and that our hearts were breaking, and that none of that changed our love of her or our ability to care for her. And so while, of course, there were extra pieces of work and logistics and challenges of being a parent as I was personally grieving, I didn't need to worry about shielding her from the experience. And so that was one more thing I didn't need to carry in a sea of things I did need to carry. In my brother's coffin was a picture that my daughter drew for him as he lay on his deathbed. I want to move on from talking about how you talk to kids about death to what happens to your child after someone dies. And in this, cancer actually has a special opportunity because unlike sudden death, death from an illness, even a brief illness, gives you an opportunity to mourn with the person who is dying. If you have let go of the part where you're shielding your kids or pretending that this isn't happening, then you get to the part where you can work with both your children and potentially even the person you're losing to figure out how to mourn their loss. My brother threw himself a living wake, and it was awesome. The key things to know is that everyone deals with death in different ways and grieving in different ways and needs different things. The number one thing I would recommend is do not assume that what your child needs, and do not assume that they need what you need. There tend to be two kinds of streams of what people need when it comes to grief, and they are not mutually exclusive from each other. But they essentially are keep things the same or make everything different. Some people want to do all the old traditions, keep every picture on the wall, do everything just the same way as when their person was alive to make sure that that person still feels present. Some want to do the opposite, make new traditions, new memories, redecorate so that they aren't constantly confronted with the person's absence. And of course, some want to do a mix of both. All options are totally valid. But in a family, they require constant communication to make sure that everyone's needs are getting met. Again, often in the name of saving their kids' pain, parents make these decisions for their children. They decide to put away the pictures of someone. They decide they're going to honor someone by leaving a chair empty at Christmas for them. And they do all of it without discussion. This removes independence, which leads to feeling powerless. Again, this teaches kids that they do not have control or autonomy. And if you've just experienced the death of someone close to you, then you're already likely in a place where you're craving some kind of control. So the more choices you can give them, the better. It also teaches them that if you don't include them, it teaches them what you want. And so it might be unlikely that they are comfortable speaking up about what they need. By contrast, choosing how you want to honor someone can be a very empowering opportunity. This is again a way of embracing that grief is a part of our home. And if you're able to have these conversations with your loved one before they die, all the better. Traditions like letters that are written before they die, left on birthdays, or together creating a photo album where you tell every story, or recording videos with that person of stories from when the kid was little to be watched on special days and occasions, are all powerful ways as a family to unify in grief. The last thing I want to say, and I'll end my talk here, is that I would encourage anyone going through this to find community. Experiencing the loss of a loved one is like being in a club, a terrible, terrible club. My kids at camp used to actually call it that. They would say that they were all part of a death club. And even though there are so many members of this club, life often makes you feel like you're alone and like you need to walk around pretending that this never happened. One of the hardest things for me since my brother's death has been what I feel is an expectation from other people to either pretend that things are okay or to grieve in a way that they can console me. The truth is, I don't really want to do either. I think about my brother pretty much every moment of every day. But at this point, I'm not usually breaking down about it. And when I am, there are very few people who I want there to see it and to help me. Mostly, I just want to be in space where it's clear that I'm constantly carrying this. Programs like the one that I ran, Camps for Kids Who've Experienced Death, there's a ton of them all across North America, or things like Death Cafes, which is an international movement to normalize death and how we talk about death, are creating things and community that, unlike support groups, are focused about normalizing death and discussing your experience of grief. This isn't to say that support groups aren't important. They're incredibly important, but it's wildly different than just being in community. Finding people who get it, who can let you be where you're at, and that know what a powerful and liberating experience it is not to be pretending. The only answer to avoiding these issues of death is for there simply not to be death, and that's not possible. So in the meantime, we need to face it and be honest with ourselves and our children about what it means. One day at a time, one step at a time, with honesty and bravery. Thank you so much for letting me speak with you today.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. That was a very poignant and very impactful talk. So I just want to thank you on behalf of Wellspring and Pancreatic Cancer Canada for being brave and coming on here today, for sharing your experience and some tools for folks to help themselves through this journey. So thank you so much, first and foremost.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
All right. So in terms of questions, there is a Q&A icon at the bottom. Folks, feel free to enter in a question there or in the chat. Sarah is happy to answer any questions that might have come up for you during the talk. So we'll just we'll just be on standby, keep an eye on the chats, and you're welcome to submit the questions.